This is our class period in the morning session of April 28, 1954, the chapel on Sunrise Ranch. Yesterday morning, we began a consideration of the basic sex principle. We recognize that the sex principle, as we think of it, is actually the God principle in action, in all levels of being. Last night, and I understand again this morning, you looked at some pictures which reveal something about the amoeba and about the principles of cellular function. I got my tongue twisted this morning. Yesterday, we concluded our meditation with a brief consideration of the core principle. The core, which has meaning in relationship to the periphery of life action. And we noted that all that is brought forth in any way, shape, or form must manifest through or by reason of the female principle. Now, in the processes of division or multiplication of the forms of the amoeba, we saw this in action. First, there was something that took place in the male principle present in the amoeba, the nucleus, and then the female principle followed that pattern that was so established. We recognize that the vibrational factors, or what we might call the magnetic or the principles of attraction, were at work. We come back to the basic principle of response. According to thy response, so be it unto thee. And as soon as the male principle divides, you remember that the form, which was in general pattern irregular, became circular, round, as far as the amoeba itself is concerned. And then there was a division in the nucleus. And the two positives repelled each other, didn't they? The two positives repelled each other. And as soon as they were stabilized in that pattern, near the outer surface of the amoeba, the negative pattern began to respond to the positive. And we witnessed the picture showing how there was the drawing together, the split, the separation, and then the pulling apart. As soon as the two halves of the female substance had responded to their respective male points of control, and the female substance had closed around the male focalization here of the male principle, the two parts began to separate. Two positives again began to be repelled. And the completion of the separation pattern is the result of that. Here we see one of the most interesting, fundamental, aspects of the application of the one law, where it can be readily recognized and understood so that we may see how it works at all levels and in relationship to all things. Can you see the board now, Isa, where I put you?
Well, yeah.
In any case, the important thing is to remember that the one law works at every level. We can see it in certain places and ways, but having seen the visually portrayed illustration of the dividing of these one-cell forms of life, we saw the application of the one law at the lowest form of life, as we speak of it. But we recognize that the more complex forms of life are dependent upon the so-called lower forms of life. And this principle applies in the multiplication of cells in the body, the process by which growth takes place. Now, if we see how the female aspect here followed the male aspect, we can also see that if the male aspect is right and the female aspect refuses to follow the male aspect, this process of division or reproduction would not appear. Now, in this sense, we recognize something creative, something that was one became two. Something that was one became two. Now, in the more complex pattern of formation in the physical realm as we know it, we have the two halves here in separate bodies. Instead of their being contained in one body to begin with, they are contained in two bodies. But according to the principle as it finds fulfillment in marriage, for instance, in the ideal pattern, the two become one. And they two shall be one flesh. In the processes of reproduction, then, at the level of the more complex form of life, which we call the human being, we see that in actual fact, the process of multiplication or reproduction does not take place until the two parts, which are in separate bodies, become one body. And when they do become one body, in actual fact, the process of reproduction becomes possible. The convenience of function, shall we say, is greatly multiplied in the more complex pattern as we know it in our own bodies. But the principle remains the same. The application of the one law, the working together of the male and the female principle in the actual manifestation of God, the Creator, in action. We cannot have bringing forth we cannot have reproduction, we cannot have any truly creative expression without those factors being present. And even if we utilize our capacities to bring forth distorted things, emptiness, sorrow, what is called evil, it is still the same principle in action. The God principle, brought within the range of man's control, reversed in relationship to its nature, and used on a destructive basis. All true evil comes from this one point. Now, I am not aware at the moment as to whether you have reached the point in your other classwork where you have begun to recognize the difference between Eve ill and Eve all. Evidently not.
No.
Well, I don't think it'll hurt anything if I just touch briefly upon it here. Eve all is a word that we have more or less arbitrarily developed in relationship to the true pattern of what is called evolution, evolving. Now, all growing is a process of evolving, isn't it? But in the world consciousness, there is an idea that evolution, by processes of transmutation over a period of millions of years, allowed the amoeba to finally appear in the form of a man or a woman. Interesting conjecture requiring more faith than I possess. I just can't believe it. Man's idea is so complicated and difficult, and God's way is so simple and easy. But in any case, there is evolution in every cycle. The moment any cycle ceases to evolve, it becomes a circle. Now, here is one of the most vital points that you will consider in your entire period of meditation here. That which is supposed to be in a creative cycle, which ceases to evolve, begins to move in a circle. And here we have the secret of life and death, as man knows it. It's a little difficult to illustrate with no more artistic talent than I possess, but we will use that to illustrate a circle. I mean a cycle. A cycle, a spiral. Actually, this might be considered as being more or less all right if you see that as the far end and recognize that the near end is no larger than the far end, although the perspective makes it appear to be so. So we'll consider this the starting point here on the inside of the spiral at the bottom. And you're looking down through the spiral on the inside. Now here we have then the starting point with respect to any creative cycle. Every creative cycle. There is a beginning in manifestation in form. And that beginning must be the result of God in action. Somehow, the male and female principles were coordinated to make possible at that level, whatever it may be, the inception of a cycle. Conception in the sense of reproduction of the human race, or the inception point, whatever it may be. Now, the inception point does not generally allow anything particular to appear in form. In other words, there must be a gestation period. So we will illustrate here, draw a line across to indicate the point between, or the point of emergence into form, recognizable form. The gestation period from inception to birth. And at the point of birth, we have the beginning of the manifestation of the form that is to be, the baby, or whatever else in whatever level. Now, all too often, human beings who share in making possible the inception of a cycle do not hold true to the principles involved and allow the gestation period to work out correctly. And most of the difficulties human beings have in life relate to the manner in which they spoil that which is taking form during the period of gestation. The evolving that takes place from inception to birth into form where physical vision may perceive the result of correct function. How many human beings blind themselves continually to the results of their own ill action by the simple process of allowing their capacities of being to be utilized in the inception of a cycle, but they cannot yet see what is taking form by reason of that inception. Therefore, a cross vibration up here that destroys that which is evolving before it has taken form so that they can see it, leaves them in a position where, when it is destroyed, they are not aware that anything was either coming into form or destroyed and prevented from appearing in form. Do you begin to see what I mean? It is there that the breaks in the vibrational pattern do their most damage, because even though human beings tend to let themselves be used creatively, constructively to some degree, that which is conceived at the inception point is all too often destroyed or caused to be subject to abortion, shall we say, before it reaches the point where it can be seen, and being seen, be appreciated. Human beings seem to think that everything outside of the human baby ought to manifest in 9 seconds instead of 9 months. And that period of holding steady, of being true, of letting the cycle work in the early stages of the evolving process is the thing that is absolutely essential. The gestation period. But the human being, not having the realization that something was actually begun back here at the inception point, proceeds to so function that it is destroyed, and he does not have any awareness of the fact that he destroyed something. So he deludes himself into thinking, well, you see, nothing comes forth. There was nothing to begin with. There couldn't be, or it would have come forth. And he doesn't realize that he himself destroyed it before it came forth into the realm where it could be seen. Now, Eve ill as against Eve all many things that are spoken of as evil are not in any sense wrong. They are merely incomplete. They have not yet come to the fullness of their formation. And the limited human vision, seeing the incomplete thing, says, oh, that's evil. When in actual fact, it is evolved, that is, in the state of evolving. And under proper care and consideration, it will evolve to its true expression of being. Without that care, it will not. And we have the responsibility of providing the care. Now, if we begin to see this, let us note what happens when we carry it out here to the point of maturity of the physical form as we think of it. Now, actually, it's still immature, but considering a human being here, the cycle of conception, gestation, birth, development in form, and consequently, what we call physical maturity. Not mental maturity, not emotional maturity, and in actual fact, not physical maturity, but the human being isn't aware of the fact that he isn't mature, and so he assumes that he is mature among a lot of other immature manifestations of human beings. Now, if this creative cycle is allowed to continue to evolve in the growing process, the individual is able to, in the cycle of maturity, keep ascending and go past his inception point on a higher level. He has been coming up. But, as human beings are, they reach the point of what they call maturity and perhaps begin to follow out the cycle to some degree, and then it begins to divide, and they don't know it. As soon as it definitely begins to divide, they say, oh, now I'm getting old. I'm feeling my years. Just think, I've lived for 55 years, and I'm getting pretty old. I'm nearly 60 or something. And instead of continuing on the cycle, the divergence has come, and he begins to move, not in the ascending spiral of true evolving, but back to his point of inception. Instead of carrying up on the spiral, it is turned into a circle. He manifests for a little ways. But then, have you ever heard it said of people who were past 45? I am, you know. So I'm being generous. They're moving into their second childhood. Say they're getting old, they're getting childish, and so on. They're moving into their second childhood. What do they mean? They mean that that person has diverted from the true cycle of his own being in the ascending spiral, and instead of moving up in the pattern so he could pass his point of inception on a higher level, he has remained on the same level or is dipping back to it. And so, in extreme cases, we have known from the standpoint of case histories of cases where individuals reached a certain point where they just didn't want to do anything but just curl up in bed. They even went back to the state of the fetus in the womb before physical death overtook them. Returning to the womb. Now, that is the result of immaturity. That individual was never mature. And the fact that human beings work in the circle instead of the cycle of the creative spiral shows that human beings today, in the overall sense, under these conditions, are not functioning on the level of maturity. Because maturity at this point, or at any point, allows the individual to remain on the ascending spiral, to continue to evolve. But the moment he fails to continue to evolve, he begins to diverge from the ascending spiral and will gravitate back to the point of inception. And then we say, oh, it was a natural death. No, it wasn't a natural death. And it's because of that that we have so much confusion with respect to death. Many things that are not death are classified as death. And much that is called death is assumed to be natural. Now, death, as we noted here recently in our meditations, is death so-called, is not death when the level is moving upward from the lower scale of life as we think of it. Remember, that's relative. Lower and higher is relative to the complexity of the organism. So, the higher scale of life is sustained by the lower scale of life. The higher evolution is made possible by that which is below in the complexity of the organism. And that which is finding fulfillment of itself by sharing in the formation of the more complex organism, whether it's one type of fish eating another type of fish, or what along the line, is not death. It isn't death at all. In the processes of nature all around us, we see this, and human beings have falsely called it death, because they themselves have become entrapped in the pattern of death, and they do not see the distinction. But that which is not sharing in evolving is that which begins to disintegrate and decay. But even in nature, for instance, consider the leaves of the tree. We say the leaves die in the fall. Actually, they don't. To say the leaves die in the fall is evidence that we are ignorant of what is taking place. Because those leaves, as such, have fulfilled their purpose, and the degree of disintegration that is involved in allowing them to return to the soil, to be picked up in a new pattern of life in the following spring, is not death for the leaf. Death for the leaf would be to have the leaf picked off the tree and preserved in a form where it is not permitted to share in the evolving processes of life expression. But that leaf doesn't have consciousness so that it says, now I am alive and now I am dead. It's a perfectly natural cycle that is not death. We need to begin to realize that. It is in relationship to the divergence from the true cycle of the thing that we have death. And that is the only point where we have death. And it is only in relationship to that we have evil. For back here, where there's the beginning of the divergence, just beginning, something may appear. Now that can be either evil or evil. If the individual maintains his pattern in the creative cycle, ascending in the pattern, it will prove to be evil. If he breaks from his cycle, it will prove to be evil. Because then it will be the lack of what ought to be, not the fulfillment. And it is the lack of what ought to be, the absence of something, that brings about the final break in the cycle that permits the form to move into the circle of return to the point of inception, instead of remaining true to the ascending spiral of creation. Now, this is basic in relationship to our understanding of many, many things in life. And until we see that distinction, we cannot begin to truly understand ourselves or others. And we must do both if we are going to truly serve humanity. Here then, we see that the continued expression of the God principle in creative action means that there must be a continual function on an evolving process. Not evolution in the sense of transmutation from one particular type of thing to another, but a movement into a higher vibrational pattern of the thing itself, until this spiral reaches the point here that becomes invisible to the human eye. It has reached an attunement with the complexity patterns of the inner realms. It is moving upward. It is in the spiral, and it crosses over from the physical realm of form as we know it into the invisible realm. And there is the step of ascension. Now, at this point, there may be a certain amount of residue left behind without there being a condition that can properly be called death. Just as you leave certain residue behind day by day, a certain amount of residue may be left behind at the time of that ascension. But here's the distinction between true ascension and the disordered pattern that we know in the world that is called death. I heard over the radio this morning the statement that scientists do not understand why certain cells go wild in the formation or development of what is called cancer. Well, we could say, if they wouldn't accept this as an answer, but obviously it is a lack of control, isn't it? Cells wouldn't go wild without a lack of control. Control is a part of the pattern: principle, purpose, design, and control. And if we have enough control to maintain the whole body and all of its capacities centered in the current of the spiral, nothing is going to be hurt. But if the control is not adequate to hold the formation in the pattern of its design in the ascending spiral, and there begins to be a divergence because of subjection to the wrong control or the lack of right control, we have the development of all kinds of disorders. And if that pattern relates to cells as such, then cells go wild, and we call it cancer. Now, there are many factors involved, but we can see that the basic factor of the male and female principles is involved in relationship to cells going wild or cells remaining in the design under control so that they may be used according to purpose for the fulfillment of principle. And yet, if we simply attempt to bring cells as such under subjection without considering the pattern of allowing ourselves as human beings the opportunity to come under control, we will never succeed. The basic essential, if we would have the less complex forms of the organism come under control or remain under control, is obviously that the more complex organism must be under control. We cannot say, we, being human beings, having a more complex form, do not need to be under the control of principle, purpose, design. According to our beings, we can be out from under control, but we expect the simple forms of the organism, the cells, to remain under control regardless. We expect the simple organisms to be wiser, and better, and stronger, more intelligent than we, the more complex organisms in the realm of physical creation. There's the breakdown in the pattern. Until man is willing to allow himself to come under control, he cannot establish a vibrational pattern within himself which permits the cells to come under control. And this is the very keynote of our work in pneumatology. To establish the pattern of control in the complex organism that we call the human being, to the end that there may be a means by which the cells and the organs and the parts may come under control. And as they come under control, we have what? Healing. Because we heal? No. Because the natural processes of growth or evolving in the body will take care of it if the complex organism as a whole is under control. Then the parts come under control. But if we try to control the cells first, we will fail. This consideration of the male and female aspects of creative principle in action, and that's what I mean when I use the word sex, at all levels whatsoever, the male and female principles in action in the expression of principle according to purpose within the scope of design under control in the creative cycle. That is sex. At all levels, at any level. From the amoeba to the highest level at which man is aware. Now, in the amoeba, we noted that the male principle or formation of principle divided first. But the female aspect did something, responded, yielded on a basis which would permit the male principle to function in such a manner. The irregular forms of the amoeba, did you notice one that looked almost in the form of a man and a woman in this particular picture? Had legs and arms. All right? Whatever that form, the process of division in the nucleus could not take place, in the sense of the true expression at least, until all of these irregularities of form in the female phase of the amoeba were cleared away and the form became round. That means that there had to be a process of responding on the part of the female formation of the principle before the male part could act in any effective sense. Here we see how it is that both men and women, of course, have their responsibilities in relationship to right fulfillment. But we see how it is that no matter how perfectly any man or group of men on the face of the earth might function, no matter what level of attainment they might achieve, it would be impossible for the fulfillment of God's purpose and design to appear on earth without the cooperation and correct function in the female aspect of mankind. Now, the actual development, no matter what the desire may be on the part of the male, no matter what urge he may feel, no matter how well equipped he may be, he can't begin to really develop into that expanded expression of being until the female aspect of mankind begins to respond and yield to that urge, to share it. That takes response. It takes positive radiation, which must be there on the part of the male. And we must admit that in relationship to mankind, many who are classified as males are a far cry from providing that positive something. But in the correct state, then it is after that initial urge has been felt and allowed release in radiation that the female aspect responds in the level of the amoeba. The formation becomes round and it holds steady. It just stays put. It provides a place of being, while the male aspect does something. There is a division, and the two male factors then are repelled because they're both positive. They find their positioning in relationship to the female factors, and all this while the female factor has remained steady, held still and steady, allowing the male aspect to do something. And then, once this positioning has been established, the process of dividing begins. Then the female principle begins to respond and yield and become a par. of the new pattern in formation. Now, I have known men who began to see something of this principle as it is presented in our work, who developed the idea that women were just supposed to arbitrarily conform. Period. Whatever they wanted, whatever they decided, the woman was supposed to just arbitrarily conform. As if she didn't have a share in intelligence, as if she didn't have a share in all the different capacities of being. But if she did not have a share in these different capacities of being, she could not be a means by which the male could have an helpmeet, shall we say, a balance point, something that would provide an equal pattern in the cycle. Suppose woman actually had the intelligence level of a good, faithful dog. Now remember, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just supposing here for a moment for illustration's sake. And we have here the male pattern, we will say, of potential, and the female pattern of potential. She's supposed to work on the level of the good, faithful dog. There would be absolutely no means by which the male could have fulfillment. The male who attempts to relegate the female into some sub-level, as if she had no ability to share in the levels of intelligence, the levels of understanding, and all the rest of it, is establishing a pattern which absolutely prevents any real fulfillment on his part, because it means that he must either die or shrink. Die or shrink to the correlating size of that which he himself undertook to establish. He defeats himself utterly. Because until there is a balanced pattern between the male and the female aspects, they cannot function correctly in relationship to each other. So, the male has a very definite responsibility here, but so does the female. Now we are in a pattern of chaos out here in the world. There's discord. There is every sort of ill thing. There is evil. That which has failed to carry through on the basis of the cycle evolving. We do not have, then, any of us, an ideal starting point. Any human being, every human being, must begin under a limited circumstance. Some imagine their circumstances to be more limited than others. But remember this, in the world as it is utterly impossible for any human being anywhere on the face of the earth to have an absolutely ideal starting point. It is all involved in the realm of chaos. But we wish to move from this realm of chaos into the realm of the Christ kingdom, the Christ pattern of design, the Christ control, the manifestation of principle and purpose. Then it is obvious that there must be a special manifestation and a basis for it of coordination, trust, faith, of tolerance, while the parties involved work back and for. If we consider it in relationship to a particular couple, in order to simplify the process, or to see it more readily, we see how both male and female must function on a give and take basis, if that marriage is to be successful. The same pattern on a different level, different pattern of relationship, but in principle, moves into all spheres of life, all patterns of manifestation. We have it here. Suppose, here in this case, where I represent the male principle and all of you together represent the female principle of our particular amoeba or sphere of function, we see that if I, without providing the right vibratory radiation which would permit the reshaping, if I didn't allow time for the various cycles and steps, if I arbitrarily took the attitude, pounding the table here this morning, well, now tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock you're going to prove that you are absolutely perfect or I'll quit. And you could well come back and say, well, what would perfect be? You see, it would be utterly foolish. In other words, I have to have a certain tolerance with respect to your phases of evolving, and you have to have a certain tolerance in relationship to what seems right in relationship to me and what you think, well, maybe that isn't right for a while. Maybe he's wrong, and so on. All right? If you get too involved in that sort of thing, you're going to become doubtful and leave, and wouldn't do any good. But if you have the right attitude toward me, and I have the right attitude toward you, we can work it back and forth until we clear the vibratory pattern of consciousness. We find that our minds meet, our hearts meet. We are here together with one accord in one place. We begin to have a controlled, unified pattern of being which we share. And then the outworking of the cycle can begin to appear. But since the formation is irregular in relationship to this body with which I am dealing, and its formation tends to be this way one day and that way the next, and so on. Suppose here at the point of the nucleus, that's an amoeba. Suppose I said, now we must have a round formation by such and such a time. A time that would not allow the proper cycle from inception to birth. An arbitrary time. Like some man might say to his wife, now you're going to conceive and I expect that baby to appear in 9 weeks. If you don't, I'm going to... 9 weeks won't work. She couldn't do anything about it, no matter how hard she tried. There has to be a cycle from that inception point to the birth point. So we're working through it. That's what we're doing now, isn't it? There was an inception. And gradually, the pattern of the formation with which I am working is changing. I have absolute confidence that if I continue to do my job correctly, on the basis of the response that is in you, one bright day, the shape of the body will round out. And we'll begin to be able to share truly in creative action. And the creative action in which we are interested is not reproduction of the race. It's the salvation of the race. The healing of the body and the mind and the heart. But it's still the same thing in principle. Because unless we work together in the right pattern, there will be no creative result. And here's the reason why. In the patterns of the world as they are known, they do a certain thing, they shape something thus and so, it stays there for a few minutes, and they say, well, we've done something wonderful. Actually, it doesn't amount to anything, because they never allowed it to emerge from this state of disordered form to the state of ordered form, where the creative process could begin. And the creative process cannot begin in the amoeba in the sense of the subdivision, first of the nucleus and then of the whole form, until the outer form here has changed to a particular pattern, that which is round. And so, with us, the Master said, and ye shall receive power after the Holy Spirit is come upon you. And they were with one accord in one place. The amoeba had become round, and the power began to appear. And to the degree that they held steady, it began to manifest through the form. But then the human mind interfered and they spoiled it. So it didn't work. And there was not subdivision after subdivision until it covered the whole earth. But if we have one correct cell in the body of humanity, and we hold true and let it subdivide and subdivide again in the true creative pattern, there are wild cells all around us out here. But if we refuse to be under the control of it, of that wildness, we are functioning according to these patterns of being. First thing you know, the cells, other cells in the body stop going wild. The wild cells are eliminated from the body, and the body begins to get well. Not because we used a chemical agent to try to kill wild cells without killing the tame ones, the domesticated ones, but because in the natural processes of being, that which does not conform to the control pattern is eliminated as waste, and the true pattern becomes dominant, and there is a return to health, life, strength, vigor, worthwhileness. The creative expression of the principle in our own lives. God in action on earth, because